Congress has just over a week to agree on a government funding bill before a shutdown's triggered next Friday. While both chambers are likely to pass a short-term measure that will keep the government's lights on through March, House Speaker Mike Johnson will face opposition from the right wing of his party. Conservatives have consisted against stopgap funding bills, which means Democrats may have a card to play in the coming days. According to Politico, Democrats will support the stopgap bill if it includes a robust package to address disaster relief across the United States. Joining us now, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale. Ali, good to see you. But let's start right there about this government shutdown deal. Yeah. Do your sources think that there's any chance the government will shut down? And then let's talk more about this dilemma that Speaker Johnson finds himself in.
The dilemma that Johnson finds himself in is a thorny one. But on your first question, no, there's not a prevailing belief that the government is going to shut down around Christmas, let alone. So we are pretty safe in that perspective. But as usual, you look at the fact that you've got about a week to solve this thing. Lawmakers are going to be eager to go home for the holidays. But a week is a long time in Congress time. And so they're going to get to a deal. You're right that the broad contours at this point will fund the government until around March. There are some conservatives that are pushing till April. But it does seem like the belief around the Hill is that this is going to be a March stopgap spending bill. But the politics of this are really difficult for Johnson, because while Democrats are coming forward and saying, hey, we'll help you bridge those tight margins with a few votes of our own if we have a robust disaster relief bill, on the other side of the equation, House Freedom Caucus members, that ultra-conservative crew, are back there saying they want to make sure that package is as tight as possible and not more broad in its spending scope. That's not shocking. That's something that the Speaker has told me he's talking to those members about. But it does put him in a precarious position not to avert a government shutdown, because at the end of the day, Democrats will go along with that one. It puts him in a tough spot, though, for January 3rd, when they actually do those speaker elections. Johnson needs to placate all parts of his conference, and we know that that conference has shrunk in size. This is going to be a game that we're watching them play at the end of the year for obvious reasons, that Democrats need to cross party lines and vote to keep the government open with Republicans, but also because the margin that Republicans are going to have going into the next Congress is going to be even slimmer. That provides possibilities for Democrats who might want to do things in bipartisan fashion, but it also presents some real difficulties for the Speaker.
Yeah, it really foreshadows some of the trouble he's going to have in the months ahead.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Well, we all learned about the three branches of government in civics class, about the two chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate, and the general constitutional structure of our government. How hard it is to get hundreds of elected representatives of all stripes to agree on big legislation. What we did not learn about is the Elon Musk branch of the government. The world's richest dude, Elon Musk, effectively bought himself control over these United States, apparently. He spent $44 billion to turn Twitter into his personal propaganda outfit and promote Donald Trump. And then he went on to spend $250 million to help get Trump elected. He is now using that authority, before Trump is even sworn in, to unilaterally determine outcomes for the American people. A guy who's never received a single vote, who is constitutionally ineligible to serve as actual president, who polling shows isn't wanted there by the American people, I guess is now effectively running these United States. So last night, congressional Republicans unveiled a short-term deal, like there have been many others in the years I've been covering Congress, to keep the government funded through March 14th of next year. It was a last-minute decision to avert a government shutdown for the holidays ahead of this weekend's deadline. Republican Speaker Mike Johnson agreed to the deal. Democratic Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Dems still have the Senate majority, agreed to the deal. But they apparently forgot to ask Elon Musk. I don't think Musk has any idea what is actually in the bill. In fact, I feel quite certain of that. He urged his followers to use AI to summarize it for him, which, but he still spent the day whipping votes against it to his hundreds of millions of followers on the social media platform he owns. He tweeted more than 70 times against the deal to keep the government open, telling Republicans to kill the bill. And then once it looked like Musk killed the bill, again, this is all Musk, okay? Trump and J.D. Vance, do you remember them? Remember those guys? The guys that ran for office? Well, then they were like, well, they came out against it as well. Oh, I guess the train's leaving the station, issuing a hasty statement on social media and telling reporters that they now want a different way to fund the government.
Would you support a clean CR? Well, what the president believes is we should support a clean CR so long as it contains a debt limit increase. That's the position of the president, and that's what we're going to try to push for.
Are you supporting a government shutdown then?
Have a good night, guys. Thanks.
Just to be clear, and we'll hit on this a little more, there's never any discussion of the debt ceiling in all of this. They pulled it out of nowhere today because Musk got ahead of him. That's why. Because Musk sees the initiative. Elon Musk, the guy who really runs things. He's not just Trump's co-president. I think that's way too low a title. He's the head dude in charge. And House Republicans certainly know who they are taking their marching orders from.
Elon put out a pretty serious post there, but that's the sentiment of the American people. This is why we won on November 5th.
When sunlight is put on these bills, when now Elon and Vivek can talk about it, when members of Congress, when we look at the bills, the American people don't like what they see.
The American people are paying zero attention to any of this. Zero. Elon put out a pretty serious post. Oh, well, then if Elon put out a serious post. The Republican House Majority Leader, Steve Scalise, confirmed the bill's not dead. It's unclear what comes next, or if there are votes for an alternate bill, as Vance alluded to, which now adds this other new wrinkle, very complex in. But Elon Musk, the guy who's running things in the Republican Party, and I guess the country, says he wants a shutdown. It's not going to hurt him. There's hundreds of billions of dollars. He's already declaring victory on Twitter, posting, "Your elected representatives have heard you." Oh, yeah, us. And now the terrible bill is dead, says the billionaire. The voice of the people, meaning me, has triumphed. Melanie Zanona is a senior congressional reporter for Punchbowl News, contributor to NBC News. She joins me now from Capitol Hill. Melanie, we have spoken many times amidst Capitol Hill chaos on this very program. You have covered a lot. This is a new one, I think.
Yeah, I am getting a little bit of deja vu from when I covered the Capitol back in Trump's first term. But now we have Elon Musk in the mix, which has really just sort of amplified the chaos. And I think it's important to point out here, we were joking about how much Republicans really are looking to Elon Musk for their cues, but they view him really as the most powerful proxy. They think he speaks for Trump. And so when he was tweeting that today, members were taking notice. That tweet was flying around. I saw people on their phones on their way to votes looking at that tweet. One of them pulled it out and showed me. And that mattered. I mean, Musk has Trump's ear. Musk spent hundreds of millions of dollars in the last election. He was talking about threatening to primary or have these members ousted if they didn't do what Musk was calling for, which was vote against this large CR, this large spending bill. And then Trump, really just threw an extra grenade into the mix when he said, not only do I not like the CR that Mike Johnson was going to put forward, but now I want you guys to consider a debt ceiling increase, which, just to be clear, no one was talking about this. The deadline is not expected to happen for another 6 months. I will say, Chris, that me and my colleagues at Punchbowl News had been hearing that Trump had been privately complaining about the debt ceiling and not wanting to have to do it on his watch for a while now. But at no point, at any point in these negotiations, were they talking about the debt ceiling. And that is an extremely complicated issue to try to throw in the 11th hour. So that's where we're at right now. We're days away from a government shutdown. Trump and Elon Musk tanked the plan that Johnson had cut with Democrats. And right now, it's just very unclear how they are going to get out of this jam. It's really, we've been calling it the nightmare before Christmas, because truly it is just a mess for Johnson and Republicans right now.
Here's the Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, came out to talk to the press, and he had this to say today. Take a listen.
House Republicans have now unilaterally decided to break a bipartisan agreement that they made. House Republicans have been ordered to shut down the government and hurt everyday Americans all across this country. House Republicans will now own any harm that is visited upon the American people that results from a government shutdown or worse.
Now, there's always an asymmetry with these shutdown fights, because I think on a sort of substantive level, Democrats don't want to shut the government down, and Republicans tend to be like, what's it? Well, who cares? So there's always this kind of imbalance, right? Like, Democrats genuinely, not for political reasons, like just out of like what they believe, don't want to shut the government down. taking that aside and the people who could get hurt, which we'll talk about in a second, politically, there's no reason for Schumer or Jeffries to help Johnson out of this jam, right?
Exactly. Let me walk you through what the Democratic thinking is right now. They did this huge bipartisan deal with Speaker Johnson. He reneged on that deal. So their thinking is, if you're going to put up a plan B, maybe a clean CR, maybe this clean CR with the debt ceiling, although I'm very skeptical of that as well, you can do that, but you're going to have to do it with your own Republican votes. We're not going to bail you out. You walked away from that deal. Why would we help you when, after weeks and weeks of these tough negotiations and celebrating all these wins that we had, if you're going to pull the rug out from underneath us, we have no incentive to help you. And on the debt ceiling point, they don't even have to address the debt ceiling for at least another 6 months here. So there's very little incentive for Democrats to bail them out, especially when it was Trump and Elon Musk who were responsible for this thing going up in flames. And if the government were to shut down, Republicans are in control in the House. The Democrats are still in control in the Senate. But I think their belief right now is that Republicans would get a lot of the blame for a government shutdown. And they're also going to frame it rightly so as this is a preview of what's to come in Trump's Washington.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've learned from this is that, like, no one remembers this stuff in 3 weeks or a month or 5 months. So, like, the long-term political consequences, I think, are minimal. Although I do think the Elon Musk idea, Musk is calling for this. Just shut it down until Trump is sworn in. A month of, like, Coast Guard folks not getting checks and, real serious things happening. That would really, I think, be a disastrous situation to inherit as Donald Trump with like a one-vote majority in the House and having to pass a CR right away.
Right. I mean, here's the thing. Musk is a billionaire, first of all, and he is not an elected politician. He does not have an understanding of how Congress works. I get what Trump and his allies are saying about trying to, we need disruptors and people who think differently because they believe it hasn't worked the way, normal politicians have tried to run government. But that being said, this is what happens when you elevate someone like Musk to a position. Johnson it's his own fault here. He elevated Musk, and now Musk is stabbing him in the back by threatening to take down this bill, threatening his members. So that's the situation we find ourselves in now. And again, this is just going to be a taste of what's to come over these next few years here.
Will the real president-elect please stand up? In just a matter of hours, the world's richest man burying what was a relatively inoffensive bipartisan bill to keep the government running in a mountain of disinformation, bringing the government to the edge of a shutdown and leading everyone to ask, who's in charge? Who's going to call the shots in Trump 2.0? A plan to fund the government filled with vital things like disaster aid and other items, things that have passed time and time again in Congress. A bill that was negotiated by Speaker Mike Johnson and the Democrats met its match in Elon Musk. Here's what happened, according to NBC's reporting. Quote, Musk posted to X about the funding bill more than 100 times over the course of the day. He repeatedly called the bill criminal and asked his followers to call their representatives. But he also posted memes, including one of him taking a sword to the bill and another referring to the Kill Bill films from director Quentin Tarantino. There were memes and primary threats and some outright flagrant disinformation. This from Politico, quote, Musk didn't seem to think a government shutdown would have significant consequences for the country. He responded yes to a post that read, just close down the government until January 20th. Defund everything. We will be fine for 33 days. The billionaire falsely claimed that members of Congress would get a 40% pay raise as part of the package, something both Musk and the X account for his so-called Department of Government Efficiency got wrong. Musk reposted a claim that the bill would provide $3 billion for a new NFL stadium in Washington. This is not true. The bill transfers control of the site of the existing RFK Stadium to the D.C. local government for redevelopment, which could potentially include a stadium. But the facts did not matter at this point to the House Republicans. When Elon Musk says jump, they asked how high. It was hours into the Musk-led rebellion against the bill when the man who is supposedly now leader of the Republican Party, that would be Donald Trump, finally weighed in. He issued a statement saying he now opposes Speaker Mike Johnson's plan. On that, the Times reports this, quote, on Thursday morning, Trump sought to reclaim control of the political debate for himself, issuing a threat of sorts to Johnson. that he must not give in to Democrats as he tries to find a way to keep the government operating without incurring the wrath of Musk. Today, Republicans went back to the drawing board, and in just the last hour, a member announced that they have an agreement on keeping the government up and running, but it remains to be seen if their master, Elon Musk, will approve of this one. And all this chaos, all the memes and primary threats and mean tweets bullying lawmakers into submission could very well be instructive, could very well be our first preview of what the next 4 years will be like. Here's former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger.
Look, President Musk this morning made it clear with all his vast government experience, which is basically he became rich on the federal government, that he doesn't want Republicans to pass this. And seemingly Vice President Trump kind of backed him up then at that point. And what it says about the politics is this is going to be a messy 4 years.
It's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard is back for us. He's still in West Palm Beach. Also joining us, publisher of The Bulwark, host of the Focus Group podcast, political strategist Sarah Longwell is here. And joining me at the table, former congressman from Florida, MSNBC political analyst David Jolly's here. Vaughn Hilliard, I am a student of patterns, and the pattern is that when someone near Trump looks more likely to be named the next time person of the year than Trump himself, that person is sometimes cast off the island. Is Musk anywhere near that kind of danger at this point, since he seems to be running Washington?
And the part is for Donald Trump that person that we're talking about is somebody who is wealthier than he is, and somebody who has a greater number of companies, and arguably somebody who has a larger footprint on his own social media platform is bigger than Donald Trump's. Elon Musk hasn't been pushed away here at this point, but I got to go back. I remember sitting on the side of the road in my car back covering the midterms back in 2022, Nicole, when there were tweets that were going out in real time between Donald Trump and Elon Musk. At the time, Elon Musk was saying how he had never voted for a Republican in his life until 2022. So this is not somebody who is steeped in conservative politics, yet now House Republicans are essentially deciding on budgets based off of his social media posts. But at the time, it was Elon Musk that was saying that Donald Trump should, in his own words, sail off into the sunset, and that an 82-year-old should not be president of the United States. And in return, it was Donald Trump who was, on his social media account, was suggesting that Elon Musk would come into the White House, into the Oval Office in his first term, and would ultimately, if he told him to, would go on to his knees. He would say, quote, when Elon Musk came to the White House asking me for help on all of his many subsidized projects, whether it's electric cars that don't drive long enough, driverless cars that crash, or rocket ships to nowhere, without which subsidies he'd be worthless, in telling me how he was a big Trump fan and a Republican, I could have said, drop to your knees and beg, and he would have done it. He went on to call him a BS artist. Those are words about Donald Trump, about Elon Musk, the now man who he is essentially held up as a proxy of his on social media at a moment in time before he's even president. But it's really quite stunning to watch him, I guess, cede so much power to somebody who he clearly didn't have much trust in just 24 months ago.
I mean, Sarah Longwell, for someone for whom all of the mythology is faux strength, but strength at any cost, he looks like he is clearly now publicly being led around by the nose by Elon Musk.
Yeah, look, I don't know. I don't like to get into the psychology of Donald Trump because Donald Trump's mind seems like a very dangerous place to try to get into. And so, look, all I can say is I think it seems like this is how he wants it. He likes having sort of Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk out there as his enforcers with Congress. And it feels like already Donald Trump's been sort of weirdly quiet as these things have played out. And it feels like, look, I think Donald Trump ran to stay out of jail. I think that's why he did it. Donald Trump doesn't care about the American people. He doesn't care about running the American government. And so right now, I think he's just set up his own reality show. And I think it seems like he's kicking back and watching how it plays out. And he's letting these other guys do his dirty work. And right now, I think this shutdown is interesting, or the potential shutdown, because I think that Donald Trump thinks that they can do this now without him being Donald Trump, catching, having to take responsibility for it. He thinks Joe Biden will end up having to take responsibility for it. And so I think it's him sort of laying down a marker of, these are my guys who are going to be running things. Everybody get used to it. But he feels like it won't sort of ricochet back on him because he's not president yet. But I will say there is something, I don't know exactly what the word would be. There's something about watching Republicans who have empowered Elon Musk, RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, Donald Trump, all people who, by the way, 10 years ago were Democrats, and in some cases much more recently were Democrats. It's interesting watching Republicans having emboldened and embraced all of these characters, only to have these characters turn around and make it 100% impossible for them to govern.
Well, not just impossible for them to govern, but I think what Sarah just described is a phenomenon you and I were sort of canaries in the coal mine been talking about since the primary 2015, that the Republican Party's embrace of Trump has nothing to do with Republican things. It has nothing to do with conservatism. Yeah. And to Sarah's point, the turning over of the levers, and now they control all the levers of power, the Republican Party, ostensibly, but to turn over the House to Musk and Ramaswamy, and to ask the Senate, also controlled by Republicans, to confirm RFK and Tulsi. It is a remarkable sort of abandoning of the party.
It's wild. I mean, so part of what we're seeing today is the asymmetry between money and democracy. I mean, Elon Musk is a billionaire bully, and he's pulling that off. But what we're also seeing is an exercise in ignorance, because nothing that Elon Musk thinks he's fighting for is actually real. And the other piece of this is, this was not a fight they needed to pick. This would have sailed through. Republicans on Capitol Hill would have had their angst and anxiety about it. But the truth is, Hakeem Jeffries and Democrats, in moments where governing was required, have done that in the last 2 years. He's led the coalition, be it on funding for Ukraine, raising the debt ceiling, keeping the government open a year ago. Democrats would have provided votes again this time. Everybody would have had a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year. Elon Musk and Donald Trump decided to pick this fight, and now it is not. I agree with Sarah's analysis about Donald Trump, but I also think Donald Trump's analysis is actually wrong. Yeah. Joe Biden doesn't bear any blame for this. This was going to sail through. The government was going to stay open. Trump and Musk, Trump and his two Doges, chose to pick this fight, and they're going to lose this fight. And so the question is, how do you get out of it now? The biggest chess move of all starts with Hakeem Jeffries, because does he deliver his caucus? Does he deliver a single vote for this? If he doesn't, there's no way out of this for Republicans, and Joe Biden's not going to get blamed for it. Donald Trump and Elon Musk will.
Look, we're already up to 36 Republican no votes. And of course, these aren't final. We're still seeing the votes come in. People could change their minds. But that is a clear indication that not only are Democrats not happy with this package, but even Republicans, and not just a handful of Republicans, 36 House Republicans say they don't care that the president-elect said this was the deal he wanted. They don't care that Elon Musk was behind this. This is not what they want. And, one of the big issues here is the debt ceiling issue. Suspending the debt ceiling for 2 years is not something many Republicans are comfortable doing. And so it's clear we're going to be back to the drawing board after this. It's hard to see what the path forward is from here. And of course, we're running out of time with the government shutdown deadline approaching quickly tomorrow.
Yeah, and Steph, tell us more about the 36. Howard Dean, and if they do speak, if they gavel anything, we'll take that. But Howard Dean was saying on the current numbers, the Republicans don't have the votes, and you're pointing out that the 37 just jumped 36 to 37 is intra-party rejection, opposition to what was this Trump-Musk effort, quote unquote. So explain more what you mean by those 37 Republicans against what is a Republican proposal.
Well, I mean, just as we see those numbers tick up more and more, it just shows that there are still a significant number of Republicans, even in the House, who are not going to just take whatever Trump gives them and vote for it, no questions asked. And it also shows, of course, this particular vote needs 2/3 majority to pass, which is clearly not not going to happen at this point. But even if they were to move on and take a little bit more time, go through rules and bring this back to the floor to try to pass it with a simple majority, Republicans don't even have the votes to pass it with a simple majority right now, again, where things stand at the moment. But a part of this whole process was so that Trump and Musk could see the votes. They could see who will buck them. They could see the names of who is willing to vote in line with them, who is willing to push back, and they can see what they're working with and move forward from there. But there's still a lot up in the air, and there was still lots of pushback to the original plan that came out just the other day. So it's not clear that the first bill would have necessarily had the votes needed to move forward. It would probably have been more likely, but it's clear by these numbers, as we see these no votes keep ticking up, that it's just not
Let's
what
listen
Republicans
in.
or Democrats
Sorry, let's listen in.
2/3 not being in the affirmative, the rules are not suspended and the bill is not passed.
There you have it. The vote is now officially formal, and we can report according to the rules of the United States Congress. The House of Representatives has rejected this Republican effort to suspend the rules to go forward into irregular order to try to get that bill passed. So that is now the House in recess. Your thoughts, Libby, about Republicans losing their vote, failing at this effort tonight?
I mean, this is remarkable. They had a bipartisan deal. And so Speaker Johnson had Democrats in the House who were willing to get on board. They lost things in this process of Republicans just throwing out the bipartisan deal, like $190 million in funding research into children's cancer. Also dealing with some things that have been talked about a lot, dealing with these pharmacy benefit managers. You might have heard commercials about that. Critics called them the middlemen between patients and insurers. Well, there was something in there that would prevent them from price spreading. There was also language in there to lower prescription drug costs. So both sides got things that they wanted, and Republicans threw it all out. I'll point out something. I really appreciated Steph talking about the numbers and how many Republicans defected. Note how Democrats hung together. They really hung together. They voted as a bloc. You know, for Democrats, this has been an incredibly crushing few weeks since Trump won and they lost the House and Senate. This is the first time I've seen them able to really get together and find a message and find a way to communicate effectively here to their supporters and to the American people. They're talking about the Musk-Johnson bill. They're trying to sort of put Musk above Trump. They're playing this strategy here that they just haven't had really the mojo to do in the last couple of weeks. They seem to have found some messaging right now, Ari.
Let's take a listen to what the speaker said just moments ago.
Is there going to be a different bill on the floor today?
Are you going to vote today? Yeah, we're expecting votes this morning, so y'all stay tuned. We got a plan.
You've reached a new agreement?
We'll see.
We'll see when asked if they actually have a deal. Those comments come with about 15 hours left on the clock for Congress to pass a government funding package and avert that shutdown. President-elect Donald Trump, after helping kill the original bipartisan funding package, is saying that if a shutdown is going to happen, to let it begin now under President Biden's watch and not his own. Let's bring in congressional reporter for The Hill, Michael Schnell, and co-founder of Punchbowl News, Jake Sherman. Jake, you just heard from Republican Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna of Florida. Jake, we still have Jake? We lost Jake for a minute. Let's go to Michael first, then we'll get back to Jake in just a second. It's a lot of commotion there in the rotunda, as you might imagine. So, Michael, just get us up to speed. We heard from the speaker a few moments ago, saying he's got a plan, but acknowledged he doesn't know if he has the votes yet for a deal. Give us the latest you've heard. Are we going to see some votes? What's the mood there on the Hill?
Yeah, hey, Jonathan, good morning. The expectation, as Speaker Mike Johnson said on his way into the Capitol this morning, is that the House is going to vote this morning and that he has a plan. But beyond that, we really do not have many details. The Speaker right there not divulging any particulars about what his new proposal is. He does have a few options at his disposal. He could put the proposal that failed yesterday back on the floor, or something that's developing and something that folks are expecting could potentially happen today is a short-term short-term continuing resolution to kick the deadline about 2 or 3 weeks. That would land in January. That would allow lawmakers to regroup, find a new proposal, a longer-term proposal, but also allow folks to head home for the holidays. Senator Markwayne Mullin, who's a close ally of Speaker Johnson and President-elect Trump, was on CNBC this morning just after Speaker Johnson had announced that he had a plan and said that one of the options, really one of the only options on the table, is this short-term CR to kick the deadline into January. Again, this is a very fluid situation. It's all a lot of moving parts, but we are expecting the House to vote this morning on some piece of legislation.
All right, Jake Sherman, I think we've got you back there. Give us the latest you're hearing from a Republican congresswoman you just spoke to and your assessment of the state of play. Are we going to get a deal tonight to keep the government open?
You better hope so if you're a Republican, Jonathan, because this is quite the inauspicious way for Donald Trump to start his presidency. He has inserted this debt limit into the negotiation at the 11th and a half hour, driving up the price. What he's done here, Jonathan, is he's made it harder to raise the debt ceiling because you need Democratic votes. And Democrats know that they could demand whatever they want from Republicans at the end of the day if Trump sticks with that demand. He's driven the price up significantly. Now, Anna Paulina Luna, who was in with the leadership this morning, said they're going to try the same thing they tried yesterday, a bill that 38 Republicans voted against. I don't know how they're going to do that. I'll be honest with you. I've been doing this a long time. I'm not quite sure I've ever seen a mess like this before. The Speaker has now cycled through 2 proposals this week. One, the first proposal, which was just destined to fail, never made it to the floor. The second proposal, Trump backed, unofficially whipped it, and just it failed miserably, showing the limits of Trump's power on Capitol Hill. The answer, I think it is I think that's right. It is a clean CR, most likely. And I don't know when they'll get there. I don't know if Johnson has some magic. It sure as heck doesn't seem like he has some magic, Jonathan. And I don't know that he could turn 38 votes on the House floor in the course of 12 or so hours.
So, Jake, I'll just underscore what you just said. You've been doing this a long time. You've never seen a mess like this. So let's go a little further here about 2 things you touched upon. One would be just the limits of Donald Trump's power over the Hill, despite him claiming this massive mandate as he comes to office. And secondly, what do you think the chances are that Speaker Johnson's going to be able to get this done and keep his job?
The second answer, I don't know if Johnson's going to be able to keep his job. The Speaker's race is in like 2 weeks. I know it seems like a long time because we have the Christmas holiday, we have the break, we have New Year's, all that stuff. I don't know. Listen, if all the people who are telling us publicly and privately that are going to vote against Johnson, if they actually do vote against Johnson, he can't make it. Now, he could turn the tide. I never underestimate anybody. He could turn the tide. He could, I don't know what he'll give away. But if those people vote no against Johnson, then Johnson's done. That's number 2, I guess. Number 1, Trump's power on the Hill. I mean, listen, he does have some mandate, right? He has the House and the Senate. That's a big deal for any president. But when you're asking a party to raise the debt limit the day before, 2 days before a shutdown, it's just not going to be successful. The guy can't defy gravity in this way, although, he just can't. It's not realistic. So this, we should put in the broader framework of tax reform, energy, border. It's not going to be as easy as Donald Trump thinks, and everybody needs to get comfortable with that. Again, not a criticism of Donald Trump, but when you have hundreds of members of Congress who have their own political incentive, it becomes more difficult.
So, Michael, let's talk about the Democrats' role in all this. We heard from Hakeem Jeffries yesterday, making it very clear that he wasn't just a no. I believe the quote was he was a hell no. It was reported. And he seems to not be inclined to have the Democrats lend a hand. They didn't yesterday. Is there any sense they would today? What would they need to get in order to help out? Or are they just content to let the Republicans own this?
I think the first question, Jonathan, is there anything on the table that they would take, that they would see in the realm of possibility of a potential trade to support another piece of legislation? I mean, it would have to be a very narrowly tailored bill, and some of them are demanding disaster aid, so that would have to be another conversation. Assistance for farmers is another topic that a lot of folks are demanding. But this is a big moment for Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic House leader. He has said that the four corners in in Congress negotiated that spending deal that was rolled out earlier this week. That was the deal. They are now accusing Republicans on reneging on that negotiation. And so Democrats are not really apt to now change the plan and go support something else because of the whims of Donald Trump and Elon Musk. So the way that Democrats have handled everything with this spending battle and all very tenuous battles in the past is they have spoken about the issue at hand as a caucus and then decided what to do going forward, really staying largely united. So I think the big question is A, what does Johnson do now if he moves forward with that, short-term continuing resolution? What exactly does that look like? What is in there? And then Democrats will evaluate. But, I mean, Democrats right now so far have been saying that they had a deal and Johnson reneged on it, and that's been their stance.
Congressional reporter for The Hill, Michael Schnell, and co-founder of Punchbowl News, Jake Sherman. We know you both have to get back to work. Good luck. We appreciate it. Thanks to you.
If the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
There we have it. It has been officially gavelled in. The Congress appears to have now had its breakthrough and be on a path to avoid a government shutdown this weekend. Julia, I had to intervene so we could hear that, but go ahead.
No, absolutely. As we said, it's not finished till the gavel strikes, and there you have it. So we'll see what the timing turns out to be in the Senate. But reminder, this passed under suspension. So not only did it need to get a majority, it had to get a 2/3 majority, and Democrats helped it over the finish line. Now, how did this happen? How did President-elect Trump be okay with the debt ceiling extension stripped from this provision? Well, a few Republican lawmakers told me that there was a handshake deal in the Republican conference meeting today where Speaker Johnson and House Republicans agreed that they would tackle the debt ceiling extension in the first reconciliation package under President Trump. So they would raise that by $1.5 trillion, and then in addition to that, go for $2.5 trillion in spending cuts. Now, some Republicans have good faith that this handshake deal will hold, but you have others like Representative Burchett who called it a joke, saying that he'll believe it when he sees it. And so this kind of kicks the can down the road. But for now, Speaker Johnson does not have to worry until after the holidays, and with Elon Musk seeming to support him, perhaps his power might not be quite as in jeopardy as it may have seemed 24 hours or so ago, Ari.
Julia, thank you, and thanks for your reporting. We've been leaning on all of our Capitol Hill journalists and colleagues. Juanita, I want to turn to you on the politics of this. I mentioned in our earlier coverage this week, there are usually off-ramps to these shutdowns. They usually get past them, and that certainly was the case finally tonight. But we also learned a few things along the way. And Elon Musk, I was mentioning just moments ago, he started the week as a kind of a radical. And by Friday night, he didn't get the main thing he was demanding. There are literally dozens of tweets to show the record of what he said he wanted. And he's saying, hey, the status quo, current incumbent Republican politician running the House did it as well as he could given the situation. I'm wondering if we're watching on-the-job training going from radical to incumbent political talking points pretty quick. And what does Elon have to show, I guess, for this week?
I feel like the only thing he has to show is that he's a South African billionaire who doesn't know anything about Congress or American politics. That's the headline here, Ari. He's backing off because he's starting to learn about the guardrails associated with him taking something from an idea that he posts about on the social media site that he purchased to actually affecting it as a plan and realizing that it's unrealistic and disconnected from reality in D.C. He's going to run into that a lot, Ari. And I think that's something that I maybe will slow him down. I do think that is not going to stop him threatening congressional Republicans again and again and again. And let's be real, that's a strong arm tactic he saw Donald Trump deploy for years. And so I think this is a wake up call to them about who's in control. And I hope that the headlines about this bill passing that we just saw was brought to you by Democrats. That's the headline. And that's why I laughed a little bit when the reporter was talking about a handshake deal among Republicans, when Republicans can't do anything without Democrats. They have no control here, even though they have a minuscule margin going into the next Congress. And with that in mind, I look to Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and I look to Democrats, and I wonder how long they will hold the line, how long they will hold up these boundaries that they set this week as an example to a guardrail on what Republicans can and can't do, because Republicans cannot do anything in the next Congress or this one without Democrats.
Molly, can I ask you a simple question?
Sure.
Have we learned this week that writing legislation might be harder than writing tweets?
I mean, I already knew that, and maybe Elon knows that now as well. I think Juanita is right that this was a pretty pointless expenditure of political capital on Elon Musk's part. He accomplished basically a 3-day delay and had very little to show for it. This bill does not reduce spending from what would have been in the original bill. It may, in fact, be more expensive. Most of the top line items that were important to people, there are some bells and whistles that got dropped, but most of those big top line items are still in this bill, which is why the House Democrats and the White House, and it looks like the Senate Democrats have come around to support it. They did not get the one demand that President-elect Trump had. So he didn't get anything out of this delay either. All they got was a lot of aggravation, and I think a wake-up call for Republicans that, as Juanita said, it is not going to be easy for them to govern with the tiny margins that they have next year. And there is going to be a lot of this type of chaos, as there was during the first Trump presidency. I mean, I am certainly having episodes of deja vu, remembering how chaotic it was the first time around. This time, with the addition of Elon Musk, it may be even more so.